Good morning and welcome to Has the Fed Made a Recession Inevitable? The latest in a series of monthly press briefings on the state of the U.S. economy presented by the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm Rob Knapp, External Affairs Associate at the Institute, and we come to you as we always do on the morning that the Labor Department releases its monthly jobs report, which typically, though not this time, falls on the first Friday of the month. In a moment, I will hand things over to Kenan Institute Director of Research Christian Lundblad, who will lead today's conversation. He will spend the first half of the briefing, the next 15 minutes or so, delivering his analysis of this morning's jobs report, as well as some insights on what may lie ahead for the economy. The second half of the show will be spent fielding your questions, which you may submit at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll prioritize questions from the press, so please include your name, title, and organization with your submission. For those joining us by phone, you're welcome to email me your questions. I'm at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can before we wrap things up about 9:30 Eastern. With that, it's my pleasure to hand things over to the Kenan Institute's Director of Research, Christian Lundblad. Professor Lundblad, good morning, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Rob. I'm very happy to share some thoughts with everyone this morning. So we've had a heck of a report. I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but let me actually preface that a little with kind of, what was prior to this morning, what was the discussion or the conversation or the conflict that we were having intellectually about where we are actually. And so I think what's quite interesting, and I'll kind of walk through this picture as that preface, is we're really struggling with understanding whether the inflationary pressures that I think we're all feeling, are they forcing the Fed's action, and is that ultimately then plunging us into a recession? And so here is a real-time estimate, as it were, what's often called nowcasting instead of forecasting. And really, where are we right now for second quarter GDP? And so in the green picture that you see sort of rapidly plunging over time, this is coming from the Fed Bank of Atlanta's estimate of what sort of second quarter economic activity is going to look like. So as we've been moving through the quarter all the way up until the present, this is basically an assessment of kind of where we are right now, in contrast to, say, some forecasts that we might see from economists, and effectively their guess for where ultimately second quarter GDP is going to land up is in the negative space, meaning a contraction. And if you put that together with the contraction that we observed in the first quarter, that looks like a technical recession, 2 quarters of economic contraction. And so in that sense, what's going on, and how does that sort of square with what we might be seeing kind of elsewhere? So, what else is on the table? Well, a tremendous amount of financial market volatility. At the time of this briefing last month, we were looking at significant inflationary prints, a continued strong labor market, and a commitment from the Federal Reserve that we were going to see some sharp movement, and indeed they did. They moved 75 basis points, 0.75% over the last time. And so with that was a lot of uncertainty that was kind of about the projection going forward that has kind of manifested in the bond market. And so now we stand here today at this morning, sort of yearning for some more clarity. And that's exactly what we got in a way, which is, holy cow, wait a second, the labor market is still really strong. And so what did we learn about the labor market today? Well, the print showed continued strong growth, with employment up by 372,000 for the month that just ended, well above market expectations. So this was a positive surprise, as a consequence, the markets are reacting rather sharply this morning. There was a bit of a revision in some of in the previous months, but on net, this is a very solid report, and one that suggests that the U.S. labor market is sort of standing in contrast with what is almost certainly a technical recession. I mean, we're very likely to see 2 quarters of economic decline, and so just squaring that all in our minds is a little bit the challenge of our time today. So, what else can we point to? Well, some of the interesting places for growth here were in in leisure and hospitality and healthcare and business services. There's some weakness elsewhere that you might expect in finance, but generally this is, you know, a reflection of the fact that we're still seeing some you know, some interesting opportunities for the bounce back that I think is well presented in a picture like this. We've essentially sort of ground our way back to where we were pre-COVID, right? So the unemployment, the overall employment in the US economy still remains slightly below where we were. Some sectors have actually surpassed this. Some sectors still exhibit a little bit of a gap. But at the end of the day, we're basically grinding our way back to where we were. And so this doesn't necessarily look like a dire situation from this perspective, you know, despite the fact that we're struggling with, you know, the inflation that I think we're all feeling, and the economic declines that are being observed along some other dimensions. Where else are we seeing some continued strength? The overall unemployment rate, so another piece that came out this morning, is essentially at a 50-year low. And so we continue to see, you know, a very strong print from that perspective. And I think what's particularly interesting is not simply the overall level of unemployment, which is, you know, technically misses some degrees of underemployment. So we have an alternative measure, which is designed to maybe more holistically, it's not perfect, of course, but maybe more holistically capture degrees of underemployment. So for example, if we have people working part-time but would like to work full-time, and again, the print on this one was pretty impressive. I mean, we're again reaching effectively record lows. So it's not simply that the unemployment rate has fallen, but it's also, you know, that other measures of labor market slack are continuing to show some strong signs. So again, just square this in your mind. A really interesting report that suggests a lot of strength in the economy from the labor market side, coupled with the contrast of what we're all feeling on the inflationary side, the Fed's aggressiveness, and what this might mean for other measures of economic contraction. Now, here is one thing that is a bit interesting. So the blue line over here captures the overall degree of labor market participation, so the amount of Americans working or actively looking for work. And the orange line here captures the prime age laborers, those who are kind of 25 to 54. And what I want to bring your attention to is sort of the craziness of COVID, right? So we saw these very sharp declines in labor force participation, both in prime age workers and kind of more generally in terms of general civilian participation. These have been grinding back. I would say prime age workers are mostly back to where they were, with a little bit of a gap. There are, however, many Americans who have retired and maybe aren't coming back. What we did see this morning, and one piece that is going to require a little bit more scrutiny as we kind of go forward, is that there is a slight dip back. So, you know, 350,000 Americans sort of dropped out of the labor force, and so some laborers here are still missing, and this one is not a great sign. It's suggestive of something sort of important here, which is what's driving that motivation. What we would like to see is Americans kind of moving back into the labor force, maybe taking some of the pressure off of the labor market and the wage pressures that we've been seeing, and then that gives the Fed a little ability to sort of you know, perhaps step back from some of the challenges that they've been facing on wage and price pressures. So that's one thing to keep an eye on in terms of what might that mean, or is this a more temporary blip? The wage pressures, nevertheless, are continuing, right? So if we sort of look at the blue, which is average hourly earnings, we can continue to see some impressive and above historical average wage pressures. And that is, again, it's just a testament to the strength of the labor market. And so average hourly earnings continue to be well above the historical trends. And so it's just suggesting the fact that that labor market tightness is still part of the story. And the challenge for the Federal Reserve then is to understand the extent to which those wage pressures, the tightness in labor markets, create then pressures for firms who are perhaps facing profit margin concerns and the like. And if their competitive, you know, markets allow them, can they pass some of those pressures on to their customers? And will that continue to put some upward pressure on consumer prices? And as a reminder, in the orange, consumer prices, so inflation is still very robust, right? So so this ultimately is our question. So here are maybe a couple of things I want to mention before before moving on. Still some tightness in labor market and wage pressures mounting. This has the potential to put some pressures on inflation, but this does mean a couple of things. One is, the inflationary pressures, if they're still present, that's going to force the Fed to act. So the next big data item to pay attention to is on the 13th, we're going to get the new print on inflation. And the market is expecting a pretty robust print, 8.8%. That's serious inflation. And that's going to mean the Fed is going to have to continue to be aggressive. But the other thing to remember is, despite this interesting print on wages, real wages, which is the difference between what are you earning and what are you paying for the goods and services that you consume, these continue to be not sort of not moving as quickly, or shrinking perhaps. So all of this is just a really complicated environment. At the end of the day, my takeaway from all of this is a very large and sizable degree of excitement in terms of the labor market's aggressiveness, but that's complicated because it puts some pressure on the Federal Reserve to act. If this continues to put pressure on inflation, then the Fed is going to have to move. And I think what this morning did is solidify another 75 basis point or three hikes, three notches, 0.75% in the Fed's meeting at the end of this month. I think that's what we're seeing. The bond market has certainly reacted in this way this morning. And so that is the Fed's challenge. The Fed is not necessarily going to be backing off. And that's really what was kind of inducing some of the financial market volatility that we saw. So what else do I want to show you before opening it up to questions? Well, we continue to see kind of robust work in average hours, right? And this is often a pretty good indicator of where the overall economy is going to be. So if you look at kind of the correlation between average hours worked, the change, and what we see in real GDP, the correlation is very high. So this kind of gives us a window as to where we're headed. And so there is this interesting disconnect between what will be almost very likely a technical recession and what's going to be a real recession. And I don't necessarily think we're going to see really a real recession in any consequential way yet. We may. That's going to come down to how aggressive is the Fed going to have to be, and how much contractionary pressures will that put on economic activity. And so I want to make that clear. A technical recession is sort of a rule of thumb. The ultimate arbiters of what is a recession are the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and those folks look more broadly, more holistically at the market, and a key ingredient there is the state of the labor market, and the labor market is still strong. And so the issue ultimately then is, maybe as we get into the latter part of this year, and most importantly, perhaps into 2023, are we going to see some of the pressures of the Federal Reserve's action actually inducing a real labor market slowdown? And then we're going to see something that feels more like an unemployment rate ticking up, more labor market slack, and something that is more akin to a proper recession that ultimately the NBR would call. Okay, those are two important distinctions. The last thing I want to mention before moving on is the following over here. So what about going forward? So what can we see? We can see three things. We can see some information in terms of activity in services and manufacturing. We can see some notions of sentiment coming from business leaders, and we can see some notions of sentiment or forecasting concerns coming from consumers. So I'm going to show you those three and then wrap up. On the amount of signals that we're getting in terms of manufacturing and service, these have softened somewhat. So these are indicators that describe the extent to which these sectors are contracting or expanding. And so what I want you to see is both of these have softened, but they do remain above 50. And so 50 is kind of the marker of whether we're still signaling some expansion or contraction. The services one is really important here. This is 2/3 of economic activity in the United States. And so we really do need to pay attention to how this is going to evolve. And so again, the direction here does suggest the potential for some slowing, but the overall print here is still suggesting some expansion, at least for the time being. Again, that's just kind of what I'm after in terms of the murkiness of all of this. Similarly so, on the murkiness, surveys from CEOs and CFOs and small business owners and small business decision makers, they are also showing some signs of softening. And so we've normalized these pictures so you can kind of see them together, but nevertheless, what you're seeing is in all three cases, whether we're looking at CFO kind of sentiment or forecasting, CEO outlook, or information that's kind of being gleaned about sentiment from small businesses, we're starting to see some concerns here. And so it is suggesting something, although I want to point out that small businesses, while showing some sentiment concerns, at the same time still have a lot of job postings and are complaining about the difficulty of finding workers. So again, it's almost squarely in this disconnect that I've laid out. And then the last thing I'll mention is the consumer. And so we have two different measures of consumer sentiment. And one is coming from the Conference Board, the other is coming from the University of Michigan. And I want you to see that these indicators that are designed to capture sentiment are also showing some downturn here, but there is nuance. And so that's the last point I want to make, and then we'll open it up for questions. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between these two. They're both sort of suggesting some souring of sentiment, but you can see a pretty large wedge in between these two, and that is exactly what we've been talking about today in a way. These measures of sentiment capture notions of where are we now, how are we feeling about current economic conditions, as well as where do we think things are going to go over some horizon going forward. And the way that these two different measures think about the horizon are somewhat different, right? So one that is in the University of Michigan looks at a somewhat longer horizon, whereas the Conference Board sort of asks questions about a somewhat more proximate horizon. So there may be some differences in sentiment that are over there. But the second thing actually is the kinds of questions they ask about. How do you feel about, a big ticket item purchase? How are you feeling about your consumption activity? Well, inflation is running hot. And so this particular indicator that puts a lot of weight on that is naturally reflecting the fact that consumers are struggling with those kinds of big ticket items. And then in the blue, this one focuses a bit more on your personal situation and may be a better reflection of kind of how one is feeling about economic activity as it pertains to labor. And again, the labor market is reasonably strong and the job openings remain. And so there are some differences here. And so just as an advertisement, we have some commentary on this from one of my colleagues, Professor Kenan-Flagler, and she basically gets into the guts of this, but it is a wonderful representation of the murkiness of where we are right now. So again, summing up, today's labor market report is strong. It suggests that the labor market is still doing very well from that perspective, but it does also raise a challenge for the Fed, because that means then that the Fed's action is perhaps going to be more impactful going forward. And then ultimately that may create the opportunities for a recession going forward, a proper one, as opposed to the technical recession that we may already be witnessing. So I'll pass it over to you, Rob.
Thank you for the analysis, Professor Lundblad, on a very interesting morning with the employment report. I'd like to remind participants that you may submit questions for Professor Lundblad using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please include your name, title, and affiliation. For those joining by phone, you may email questions to me at rob_knapp@Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. So let's get to the questions. This one is from Jason Parker of WRAL TechWire. Are there any observable differences in the labor market with regard to large, more urban MSAs compared to small MSAs or rural areas? Put another way, are we seeing job growth uniformly across the economy, or are there regional winners and losers in the labor market?
That's a great question. So I caution to look too much on any one report with regards to this, because things do tend to be noisy. But the general trend, of course, of what we've seen over the last reports and kind of where the economy is there is no one labor market. There are labor markets, plural, right? And so how does that manifest? Well, obviously there's sector variation, meaning different industries, but there's clearly then different variation within the regions of the United States and the urban-rural divide. So for example, We're seeing obviously certain sectors that are changing, and because different regions have different sector representation, we also have variation in the migratory stories. The United States is sort of moving as a consequence of COVID, and a whole lot of other sources of variation. So the answer is yes. So who's going to be a regional winner, I think, is a lower frequency and a longer run statement. And I think some of the regions where we're going to enjoy kind of who's going to come out of COVID and the ultimate recovery with the sort of next story, and that may be regions that are different from where they were before. I think those are the kinds of the things we want to keep an eye on. But I would caution against looking at any variation in one or two prints, because I think that can be a bit noisy.
It seems like COVID will continue to play into the equation for some time.
Indeed.
Before we move on, I wanted to make sure I let folks know I dropped a link into chat to the commentary that Professor Lundblad mentioned earlier about consumer confidence indexes. It is a very interesting read, and I would recommend it highly. Next question is from Jason DeBruyne at NC Public Radio. Jason writes, Elizabeth Warren and other progressive senators have questioned Chairman Powell about the effectiveness of the Fed in this particular inflationary environment. Warren argues that the inflation items that the Fed will influence, home and business borrowing, are not the same ones where Americans are feeling the biggest hit: food, cars, gas. Would you agree with her? If yes, or partially, will it not then limit the effectiveness of the rate increases, especially in areas where middle America is most concerned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So clearly, right now, some of the biggest components of the inflation that we're observing are tied to things like energy, and that has an element that is very much out of the hands of any central bank, for obvious reasons, not the least of which is it's tied to sort of geopolitical conflict. And so I would say two things. Number one, that's part of the reason why the Federal Reserve often looks at an inflation measure that is stripped of food and energy. That's what they call core inflation. That generates some conflict because those are two of the largest things that affect the household, but the Fed doesn't do it for any nefarious reason. They do it simply because the inflationary pressures over which they have control, and over which they think that is a reflection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply imbalances, can maybe are less linked sometimes to what's happening in agriculture or what's happening in energy. And so that's one component, right? And those numbers still show some inflationary tick-ups that are worrying, right? So even if you sort of look outside of food and energy, and so that's still suggesting the fact that there may be some important mismatches between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and then the Federal Reserve is tasked with responding, right? But the second thing is, what else could we do then? Well, the reality is inflation, as we're observing it, is made up of a lot of different things, and the Federal Reserve has to tackle what it is that they can tackle. But there is a role for Congress and for the policymakers then to respond along some of these other dimensions, and so ultimately then that's about optimal degrees of regulation, optimal degrees of trying to alleviate some of the supply chain challenges that still remain. And frankly, I think the third component is the reality that for all of us, and certainly that's true for Americans, but it's especially true for Europeans, this conflict that we're observing is going to be with us for some time, and the energy consequences are there. And to the extent that we have some resolve in fighting a battle, as it were, against an aggressive force, the energy pain that we're going to feel is going to be the necessary consequence of that.
Okay, thank you. Question from Chris Faulkner McDonough. Typically, the labor market is a lagging indicator of economic activity. Is there something in today's report that you look to as a more forward-looking indicator of activity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, the labor market report has the advantage of being reasonably fresh, right? In the sense that it is the first Friday often of the, after the end of the month. But the reads we get are certainly necessarily somewhat backward looking, and maybe even more so to the extent that these are, decisions made by firms and laborers that, that were already in place. So I think what we're looking for right now, honestly, is as much as we can, a signal of where we are. So where are we going is a bit difficult to even gauge at this stage, but don't lose sight of the value of where we are, right? In a situation like this, where we're struggling with understanding the inflationary pressures and their various sources, understanding what, some of the decisions then that are being made for by businesses and households in terms of generating economic activity. And then third, where is the health of the labor market? And all of those as kind of ingredients for where we are. I think that's really valuable at present. So in terms of what am I trying to look for that's going forward, again, I mean, to the extent that we can try to learn something about the wage pressures that may or may not be continuing, the extent that laborers are moving in and out of the labor force. I mean, all of these are things that one wants to try to gauge, use to gauge where we're headed. But it's difficult to know necessarily where we're headed right now. I think the precursor to that is, where are we right now? And so to the extent that we can try to get a better sense of the health at its moment of these critical ingredients, I think then that allows us to at least begin a conversation.
So it's difficult to tell what's going to happen. So here's a question asking you what's going to happen. Based on this report, what is your assessment of the probability of an actual recession rather than a technical recession this year?
Yeah, so I think the probability of an actual recession, meaning what the NBER would call, and again, that's about real economic slack, and it's more holistic than just 2 quarters of economic growth declining. I think we're going to get 2 quarters of economic growth declining, the first 2. I think something that the NBER is going to be more concerned about, and what really we're going to feel, perhaps with a true slowdown in job creation and a serious possibly tick up in the unemployment rate, I think that's more likely to transpire in 2023. Listen, the Fed is tasked with responding. That's their job. The Federal Reserve has to move, and to the extent that the labor market report is good today, and that does transpire with greater degrees of inflationary pressures that come through the wage channel, the Fed is going to have to keep moving. And again, I think the license now is a clear 3-quarter notch increase in their next meeting. And I think if inflation continues to run hot, the Fed is going to keep moving, and their job is to slow things down. They want to do it in a way that's sort of Goldilocks and kind of has what's a so-called soft landing. But if inflation continues to mount and maybe even surprise on the upside, the Fed's going to engineer a real recession. That's their job right here. We don't like it. I mean, it hurts, but it is less painful than the long run consequences of inflation. And so I think that's more likely what we're going to see, is the Fed continuing to move, slowing down the labor market properly. And I think that's likely to hit in the early to mid part of next year.
All right. Well, a lot to say this morning. That's the end of our time. Thanks again, Professor Lundblad, for sharing your insights on an interesting morning from the numbers. And a special thanks to everybody in the audience who took the time to join us, who, as always, offered up a lot of great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to field all of them, but we'd be happy to connect you with Professor Lundblad or any of our other in-house experts to continue the conversation. You can email me at, one more time, rob_knapp@Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. We'd also be happy to support your coverage on other business and economic issues. We invite you to learn more about our areas of research by visiting kenaninstitute.unc.edu. We hope to see you again August 5th, when we'll be back with another economic briefing. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great Friday.